So Laura and I were chatting, and we've released a few of these videos so far. We wanted to do something a little different, so we've decided to do a mock interview. Most of my background has been recruiting in the private sector, and what's interesting about Laura's background and her CV is she's worked across both the private and public sector. So I'm interested, Laura, firstly, before we kick off, to know, do you have any reflections on the type of differences between the public and private sector in terms of the interview process and questions?
Public sector questions that I come across, I think they are different. I think, first of all, they lead a lot more with the head, I'd say, than the heart. So the process is designed not so much for picking someone you like or feel an affinity to for whatever reasons, but to ensure a fair and transparent process, the questions are normally much more measurable. And I would say that the way to do well in public sector interviews is to have that in mind and imagine how the answer would be measured, which I know is really difficult off the cuff, but if you practice it, you can get a good understanding. And a lot of questions fall into similar categories. And if you have in mind the mark scheme, you'll do better. So the mark scheme will normally reflect whether you've given an example of a significant depth and whether you've answered the question with sufficient expertise or excellence. Okay, and it can be a single mark or it can be both. So I think it's really important in those public sector interviews not just to establish rapport, but also to really kind of land your points a little bit like bullets on the targets as you go.
So Laura, thank you for coming for the position of head of property. How would you deal with a client or stakeholder that is unhappy with your advice?
I have three things that I really try and apply. I always, if possible, create a stakeholder matrix to consider the impact and influence of my stakeholders. I use some of the elements of the negotiation skills I've acquired over the years, and I really endeavour to build relationships with stakeholders, particularly regular touch points. A good example where I recently delivered those three elements was in a complex situation with my sustainability department, who were requesting quite a lot of very innovative but ultimately not financially or practically feasible ideas in the estate. So I considered, although noisy and important as they were, where they were on my stakeholder matrix, and felt that their influence was perhaps quite low, although their impact was high. So I worked with them to consider what were their true objectives, and it turned out it wasn't so much the solutions, the technologies they wanted, but it was in fact to reduce our carbon emissions. We came together to find some more reasonable and implementable solutions that actually were possibly better than the original, considered in the round with all of the other constraints. But I ensured that going forwards, I made regular touch points with the sustainability team so we didn't get to that divergence again. And that I also gave them really good regular touch points on the progress of the measures we had taken, so they didn't lose confidence and feel that perhaps that their original ideas would have been better. And in that way, we managed to turn quite a tricky stakeholder in sustainability into a very supportive collaborator ultimately across the estate. This was also a really interesting time that I was able to see the bigger picture and take a long-term view, because some of the carbon reduction ideas were quite short-termist. But by having these detailed discussions, we were able to create a 5, even 10-year plan once I'd gained that trust. So that's something I'm really proud of and we're still working on today.
How do you handle competing pressures?
Competing pressures are very much part of life, particularly in facilities management and property, where everything's urgent and everyone's definition of urgent is always right, as I'm sure you know. One of the more strategic issues I had recently was that I was required to review some of our statutory compliance policies while also having to meet some quite tight deadlines to pitch for money, writing board papers. Ultimately, I find the best way to manage competing pressures personally is to treat my workload a bit like a project with a project plan and a timeline. And that lets me prioritize the work I'm doing. In that instance, reviewing the policies turned out to be something that I felt that I could delegate. And working on the board papers was something that, although I needed to sign off the final view, I was able to call in a bit more of a team to help me bring them together, and I sort of compartmentalized them into different sections so that ultimately I didn't have to write the whole thing. It was more of an editing role. So by both reducing the amount of work, but also reprioritizing the elements within those different asks, I was able to bring things together. Now that isn't always possible. So there are times when you have to bring in extra resource, or ultimately you have to make a sacrifice on time and quality to meet the deadlines. And I make a real point to advise people, if the ask is becoming unreasonable, that we can do that, and my department can do that, but there might need to be maybe a first draft rather than the final version. And that's another useful tool I found to allow us to meet deadlines, but perhaps give ourselves a bit of flexibility in order to make further edits and get them a little bit more polished later.
And thirdly, share a time when you took on additional responsibilities.
Well, I'm really proud of this actually as a moment in my career. So thank you for asking this in the interview. In my last role, I was brought in to do a large disposal programme, really looking at surveying and the paperwork of buildings. But I was offered the opportunity to diversify into facilities management, which was an area I'd long been interested in. I find that whole relationship of people, space and place, it's all become a bit cliched now perhaps, very, very interesting. And I actually did my university dissertation on those subjects. When the role came up in facilities management, I really jumped at the chance. There wasn't any extra remuneration or status. It was actually described as a bit of a poison chalice at the time, I'll be honest. But I invested in the role, and I requested additional support and training and professional membership to get me up to speed. I wasn't shy to ask for the help that I needed to get set up in terms of external consulting and support to get my feet under the table, and also clear some of the more urgent issues when I wasn't yet ready to take them on, so I could have a firmer grounding of my role. And many months later, I feel very competent in my understanding of the discipline. And in fact, the team went on to win awards in facility management. So overall, I was really pleased I took that gamble. And well, I shouldn't really call it a gamble, that I took that opportunity and made the most of it. And I'm very grateful to the line manager that gave me that option, because that was a big chance he took. And I've really tried now to afford that to others. When I see potential in people, they might not be there yet in terms of experience, but if I think they can get there, then I think it's really important we give people the opportunity to develop. It's very challenging in property to cover all disciplines. When some people come construction, some surveying, some facilities management, there's a moment where, as a leader and a manager, you need to give people those opportunities to spread out. So I really try and do that for my team where I can.
That was perfect. I really enjoyed that. Very different, as you rightly said at the outset, to perhaps the interviews that I'm more used to. And I can imagine it's incredibly useful for those people watching it who are about to undertake a public sector sort of orientated interview. Is there one thing, Laura, that people could take away from this or should take away from this?
So I do have a bit of a pet hate. It is a personal hate of mine. So, you know, I'm not an HR professional, but I get very frustrated when people don't use that last moment of the interview. Do you have any questions as an opportunity? Now, going back to my point about scoring, that is not always a scored question in the public sector. So but it's still an opportunity. It really is. And I find it very frustrating when people either say no, or they ask me something that they could really email HR almost a second after the interview closes, like, will my travel expenses be covered? Or worse still, when will I hear about the interview? I'm not denying that that's an important thing to know, but it's not necessarily the right thing to ask them. I'm looking for someone who gives me a sense that they really want the role, and I want to be left with the impression of working with that person in post. And so this is the opportunity, in my eyes, to ask that forward-looking question. All the other interview questions are backward-looking. When did you do this? When did you do that? If you are smart, you can use that any other questions moment to put yourself in a forward-looking perspective, really create the idea of what you would bring, that you really care, what it would be like to work with you on a professional level.